So the most important thing, or one of the key things in the Bredrins of a Common Life, is when we are picking, we are picking our leaders, and when we are picking our leaders, we are looking. We the Bredrins of Common Life is encouraging people to pick leaders who are philosophers.
Mm-hmm.
These philosophers need to be well versed in the three documents, three principles or three items that Big Foe has eloquently showed us in previous videos. The first one is the Federalist Papers, specifically the ones that are written by Alexander Hamilton between 1 to 13. All right. The second one is Plato in His Own Words by Jim Cooper. These are writings, these are documents of Socrates and his Socrates philosophies, his how he lived his life, the principles he believed in, the principles he died for. So we want to understand that as philosophers. The third part is charms, mathematic documents, any kind of mathematic textbook or Cole's notes, if you will, by Chalmers to understand mathematics. These three items, these three key principles, these three documents, if you will, are what will build a philosopher who will be able to lead the new black man movement for the Bredrins of a Common Life. All right. So as we talk about the philosophy and what those components are, who we want that new black man to be, to follow those, to read those documents and be well versed in those documents. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the flattery. So who is the flatterer? Give us a little history of the flatterer.
It would be basically the opposite of what you just described. Okay. So if we're saying that those are the starter kit of what is like a prerequisite for being able to be a leader in governance, right? To know about statecraft and things like that, you do need to be familiar with those things that we just described. But also, if there's another side of the coin, which is the flatterer, which is the con man, which is the rhetorician and the persuader, we need to be able to point out and identify when those charlatans are taking office or when those charlatans are in our mix.
So wait a minute, because when you talk about persuaders, the art of negotiation, I have a business background. We've talked about this. We touched on this in the past. And when I'm in a sales, situation, I have to persuade somebody. I got to influence somebody, there are certain techniques, certain tactics as a salesman that we use to, get the sale done, to do business. So are you saying, like, as a philosopher, I can't use those tactics to win?
I would say that for the most part, if you have to use those tactics, your main thing would not likely be philosophy, because the philosophy is it's more like it's not what needs to be sold, right? The philosophy, it would be the equivalent of a product that sells itself. There's no persuasion necessary. You don't need to say, "Oh, wouldn't it look good?" And you don't have to do any of that. That is those types of competitions, which are like the flatterers are the master experts of it. They're the first ones to do it since ancient times, and they're the masters of it still today. What they're able to do is sell, sand in the desert, sell water to a well. The well does not need water. So this is where it's a good skill to have, but you usually only need the skill when you're trying to sell somebody something that they do not need.
Okay.
So that's let's start with that. as far as where it comes from, it's very, very ancient. It's almost natural to go into a flattery situation. It's firstly, you should think of it as something that contrasts with philosophy, as we were saying before in the last episode, like a friendship with understanding or wisdom. Philos, Sophia being wisdom and understanding, and philos being friendship with or love of. So if you look where typically you can say that this concept of flattery, or where the first flatterers were showing themselves, were in opposition to the first philosophers. So if you go back to ancient Africa, where people were doing the first mathematics, you have things like Ishango's bone in Uganda. You have like the Nile Valley civilization, right? These are long time ago, when people were going from being in our beastly lower condition to rising ourselves up to being thinking man, right? To understanding the seasons and learning when to plant and really taking control of nature, raising our ability, increasing our ability to control nature, to live in nature, and to thrive within nature. These were natural laws that we understood. These are things like Jehuti, the master of science, philosophy. It's the god of Egypt, Jehuti. So when his concepts, right, when all of this was being laid out, there was a great power in all of this, right? So in the beginning, those people that possessed that power were given authority, right? But at some point, some people that were also powerful in terms of wealth, in terms of numbers, in terms of cleverness or whatever, they realized that it was not necessarily necessary to actually have that power of understanding, that power of knowing, that power over nature. If you could pretend to have that power, you could still get the same authority.
So flatterers pretend to have power. Flatterers are powerless.
They're absolute. Yes.
So it's the listener or the crowd, the audience. We give the flatterer the power.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And their ability to persuade is how they elicit that power from you. Because they play on basically on your own. They play on your ignorance. They play on your prejudice. They play on all the bad qualities that you have. They play on your lower self, the beast in you, right? They play to sex. They play to that your immediate pleasure, and avoiding pain. They can scare you, right? But where these guys come in historically is that if you look at the Egyptian Amun-Ra, the craft of Amun-Ra, right? So these people, in the beginning, you can say that they were righteous, right? Where these were the ones that were helping the pharaoh out by dedicating themselves to knowledge, dedicating themselves to solving problems that the pharaoh had and that society had, right? Mm-hmm. But then they eventually became isolated, right? And they would be the people that would take the pharaoh's children, and as Dr. Ben teaches us, they would have them for 40 years, mm-hmm. right? So this is a long time to be in control of all of the nobility's children, right? So this gave them a lot of power. And there was a temptation at this time to sometimes deviate a little bit from the actual universal laws that they were learning or whatever, right? So if you the first flatterers would have been those people that were dedicating themselves to learning, right? There would have been some of them that might have been corrupt and would have not wanted to stick exactly to what the truth was, because they're the only ones that know it, So if they're the only ones that know it, how are you going to know if they are giving you some corruption?
Okay.
So that's where they start. So then what happens is, in the beginning, they were the people that were helping out the pharaohs, right? But eventually they realized that they don't necessarily have to be loyal to the pharaohs at all, because they themselves were in some ways more powerful than the pharaohs, because people had to give, they were the ones who were receiving donations. Like I say, they have the minds of the children, right? So if the pharaoh gives his son to me to teach him, I can turn that son against him and towards me. So eventually they started building up this power where they didn't really need necessarily to be loyal to the pharaoh. And they would be not even necessarily need to be loyal to this nation. So they ended up putting themselves in a position where they didn't need to be loyal to any nation at all, where they could benefit from actually being associated with many different nations. And this is what you see rising up in Babylon. So you can say that the seed of it started out in Egypt, where you had, and you can look at all the different breakup periods in Egypt, whether it was the first intermediate period that ended the old kingdom, or the second intermediate period that came after the new kingdom, or all of these different periods. Or if you look at Akhenaten, right?
When you're talking about the first period and the second period, we're talking about like 7,000 BC, right? Before pyramids were built.
No, I'm talking about after the pyramids were built. When you saw that like the old kingdom, right? There was a whole bunch of dynasties that went through the old kingdom, and there was continuity through all of it, right? But then Egypt basically fell apart. It went into a dark age. Yes, but the way that it went into the dark age is that these priests took up their own power, and some of them would become pharaohs themselves. So you would have a pharaoh over here in the north and another pharaoh over here in the south, or a bunch of pharaohs that are fighting for power. But this would all come because they weren't dedicated. Their cult wasn't necessarily dedicated to empowering the pharaoh. And sometimes they would know things that he wouldn't, and they would use that gap in knowledge against him. So that's when you would see the collapsing of each time, because there would be a fight in power. And if you look at someone like Akhenaten, who started his own cult, that's one of the reasons that he was doing that, is because these other priests were becoming so powerful that it was a competition. And you could see very quickly after he died what they did to him, right? And then his son, who was very easy to manipulate by these people, you can see that that Tutankhamun, he switched his game and ended up, changing his name, because his name was Akhenaten. He was named after his dad. I don't have it off my top of my head what his name was right then, but they changed it to Tutankhamun, which is like a disrespect to actually his dad. And if you look, they tried to bury even the memory of Akhenaten, who we know now is like the first monotheistic, who brought the first monotheistic religion, right? Before, thousands of years before Moses or whatever. So this is an example of how this flattery, where the seeds of it came from, because those priests started to realize how much power they could have by the authority that was given to them based on an assumed power that they had. And they would often claim to have more power than they actually did have. And this is where you get the Babylonian or the Mesopotamian oligarchy culture that was mostly based on this. They didn't really have the Egyptian history where it started out as a natural law thing. They started out with the power of the flattery, where these are the crystal ball, the fortune tellers, right? Some people say that it has something to do with the Nile River was such a natural river that was predictable, so they learned to be to predict and to have that kind of an allegiance to natural law, whereas the Euphrates rivers, they were chaotic and they would flood for no reason and flash flood. So it was hard to have a concept about what kind of God would make that kind of a unpredictable thing. It seems like nothing is predictable, so you have to go to someone special to be able to do the predicting for you. So that's what you have in Babylon. In Babylon, you have this concept of the fortune teller, right? And arbitrary law. This is where the concept of arbitrary law comes in. Whereas before, the law was always derived in some way from the natural law, natural understanding, universal understanding of law, right? That comes right from Ishango's bone all the way to building up the pyramids. But on the other side, where we have in Babylon, you have something else. You have a cult of pretending, where the leaders were pretenders to power, right? But they were very convincing, and over that time, they really put expertise into their flattery, their rhetoric, right? So they were going to pretend to have power so that they can get the authority, and then from that authority, they would conquer all the things that they conquered. Now, if you see that Babylonian culture is the culture that conquered what we know as like the Mediterranean and the Greek culture, because the Temple of Apollo that we spoke about before in the last episode, that was a transplant from the Middle East. So that Babylonian power that became the Assyrian power that became the Persian power, right? That same cultural ideology, right, was what kept spreading west and west and west until it got to what we know is now Turkey, right? And from there, they launched into what we know now as Greece. Mm-hmm. So the Temple of Apollo was really a Persian transplant. Okay. That's why when you look at who they were always supporting the Persians. And it would seem like, why is this Delphi people always like giving advice that is counterproductive to the people that live in Greece, but is benefiting those people that are coming to conquer them? So that's a brief history of where they come from, right? And so but in order to maintain their power, they have to always be at war with the natural law, because the natural law is speaking completely against them. Everything that they're doing doesn't follow natural law.